The 28th of March 1941, the Mediterranean after midnight. The sea is calm, almost indifferent. No moon, no horizon. Only darkness pressed flat against steel hulls moving slowly through the water south of Greece. Engines hum at reduced speed. Men stand at night stations, eyes straining for shapes that should not be there. They do not know they are already being watched. Far beyond visual range, invisible waves bounce back from metal and return as certainty. Bearings are plotted, distances shrink. Orders pass quietly from bridge to bridge. Guns are trained, not at shadows, but at coordinates. The Italian cruisers, ahead, believe night has saved them. Their doctrine says battles are fought by sun and sight. Darkness is protection. Darkness is escape. They are wrong. At point blank range, searchlights will snap on like lightning. Heavy guns will fire almost horizontally. Entire ships will vanish in minutes. Crews given no warning. No chance to understand what is happening. This will not be a battle of maneuver or courage alone. It will be a demonstration. And as the British fleet closes in, the silence of the Mediterranean becomes the final warning. 1. The Italian Navy will never hear, as the story now widens to explain how the world arrived at this night. By early 1941, the Mediterranean Sea had become one of the most tightly contested theaters of the Second World War. Not because of its size, but because of what it connected and what it could sever. For Britain, the Mediterranean was a lifeline. Through it ran the shortest route between the British Isles and the Empire's eastern holdings, Egypt, India, Australia. The Suez Canal was not simply a passage of ships. It was the artery that kept British power circulating. Every convoy that passed through it carried fuel, ammunition, food, and men needed to hold North Africa and the Middle East for Italy. The Mediterranean was destiny. Benito Mussolini had declared it Mare Nostrum, RC, reviving the Roman dream of dominance over the central waters of Europe. The Regia Marina, Italy's navy, had been built with this vision in mind. On paper, it was formidable: modern battleships, fast cruisers, skilled crews, and bases that stretched from Taranto to Rhodes. Yet geography cut both ways. Italy's long coastline was vulnerable, and its fleet depended heavily on shore-based air cover. Fuel shortages limited training, and the Navy's doctrine remained rooted in daylight engagement, where speed, gunnery, and visibility could be controlled. Britain, by contrast, fought from necessity. Its Mediterranean fleet, based at Alexandria, was often outnumbered. Ships were older, resources were stretched thin by commitments across the globe. But British commanders understood that control of the sea did not require constant victory, only denial. If Italian convoys to North Africa could be disrupted, Axis armies would starve of fuel and ammunition long before reaching Egypt. By March 1941, the stakes had risen sharply. German forces were moving into the Balkans. British troops had been sent to Greece. Supply convoys began crossing the eastern Mediterranean under increasing threat. Italy, under pressure to assert itself and support its German ally, prepared to strike. And as fleets maneuvered across the map, an invisible battle had already begun. One not of ships and guns, but of information and belief, setting the stage for the decisions that would soon unfold. Long before the first shells were fired at Cape Matapan, the outcome was being shaped in rooms far from the sea. In Britain, intelligence had become a weapon. By early 1941, British codebreakers were reading significant portions of Italian naval communications. Movements, intentions, even planned rendezvous points were often known hours or days in advance. This information was handled carefully, filtered so that its source remained hidden, but it gave British commanders something invaluable. Confidence. Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, commander of the Mediterranean Fleet, understood what intelligence could and could not do. It could not replace ships, it could not calm rough seas or steady frightened men, but it could tell him where the enemy would be and when. That knowledge allowed him to accept risks that would otherwise have been unthinkable. Italian command decisions were shaped by different assumptions. The Regia Marina did not dismiss intelligence, but it did not imagine the extent to which its signals were compromised. More critically, it trusted in doctrine forged before the war. Italian naval thinking emphasized daylight action, supported by reconnaissance aircraft. Battles were expected to unfold at long range, with spotting planes correcting fire and air cover deterring enemy approach. Night fighting, by contrast, was seen as chaotic and dangerous. Training for it was limited. Italian ships carried few radar sets, and those that existed were experimental and unreliable. Commanders believed that darkness favored disengagement, not combat. The British thought otherwise. For years, the Royal Navy had invested in night operations. Crews drilled endlessly in darkness. More importantly, British ships now carried operational radar. Primitive by later standards, it nonetheless transformed night from a barrier into an advantage. Ships could be tracked without being seen. Formations could be maintained without lights. Targets could be approached unseen. These two worldviews, one trusting in sight and sun, the other in instruments and silence, were about to collide. When the Italian fleet sailed in late March, its commanders believed they were entering a familiar contest of speed and daylight. They did not know they were stepping into a contest already decided by what they could not see. And as these unseen differences began to matter, the human consequences of doctrine and technology started to surface, demanding a closer look at the men and machines behind the plans. The first angle is human, and it begins below deck. Italian sailors were well trained by the standards of peacetime navies. They were disciplined, proud, and deeply conscious of tradition. Many served on ships that represented the height of Italian engineering. Sleek hulls, powerful engines, precise gunnery. But their training reflected what their navy expected them to fight. They drilled under clear skies. They practiced firing by optical rangefinders. Darkness was something to endure, not exploit. When night fell, watchstanders relied on eyesight alone. Lookouts strained for silhouettes. Officers trusted that if the enemy could not be seen, he could not fight effectively. It was a belief shared across much of the pre-war world. The second angle is technological, and it lives on the bridge. British radar did not offer images or certainty. It gave blips and bearings, often imprecise and unstable. But to commanders trained to trust instruments, it was revolutionary. It allowed fleets to maneuver without revealing themselves. It meant a ship could aim its guns before a target was ever visible. At night, this advantage multiplied. The third angle is leadership, embodied by Admiral Andrew Cunningham. Cunningham was aggressive, but not reckless. He believed in closing with the enemy in decisive action. Intelligence gave him opportunity, radar gave him confidence, and experience gave him restraint. He did not intend a chase or a show of force. He intended destruction. If conditions allowed, each of these elements existed independently. Sailors, machines, commanders. None alone guaranteed victory or defeat, but together they formed a system that would be tested in the dark waters off Cape Matapan. And as one side prepared to strike with certainty, the other moved forward believing the night would protect it, setting up a second perspective, one shaped by limits rather than advantages. The fourth angle is Italian command constraints. Admiral Angelo Iachino, commanding the Italian fleet, faced pressure on multiple levels. Mussolini demanded action to assert Italian dominance. Coordination with German ground forces in Greece was necessary. Logistics were fragile, fuel was limited, repair yards crowded, and convoy schedules tight. Iachino had to balance aggression with caution. The night offered cover, but cover could not compensate for overextended supply lines or limited reconnaissance. Decisions were made with partial information, as uncertainty had already begun to shape fate. The fifth angle is moral. Cape Matapan would later be remembered for the suddenness of the carnage. Sailors were lost without warning. Entire crews swept from decks in minutes. While strategy dictates action, the human cost of this trap cannot be ignored. On both sides, men faced fear, confusion, and the unrelenting force of technology. War had stripped distance, surprise, and darkness into a lethal moral crucible. The sixth angle is enemy perception. The Italians did not anticipate how their opponents would act under the cover of night. Even when radar bearings were faintly detectable, they were interpreted as echoes or false contacts. The British, by contrast, knew exactly what was in front of them. This mismatch between expectation and reality was as decisive as shells and torpedoes. Perception misaligned with reality would amplify the impact of every decision made at sea. With these angles, the human, technological, leadership, Italian constraints, moral, and perceptual, the stage was fully set. Every factor, every misjudgment, every advantage was now converging. The darkness of the 28th of March, 1941, was no longer just a backdrop. It was an instrument, and within it, the moment when theory became action was about to arrive. Night had fallen completely over the southern Aegean. The Italian fleet, consisting of heavy cruisers Zara, Fiume, and Pola, accompanied by lighter ships, steamed cautiously south of Cape Matapan. Their engines whispered through the water, unaware that every movement was tracked. Darkness, which had always been their shield, now betrayed them. British ships lay in wait, invisible and silent. Destroyers patrolled ahead, radar screens glowing faintly in dimly lit bridges. Cunningham's plan was simple: isolate, ambush, and annihilate. His fleet's positioning was meticulous. Battleships would not risk daylight gunnery against superior Italian armor. But at night, at point-blank range, heavy guns could fire almost horizontally, achieving devastating accuracy. As the Italian cruisers advanced, they had already sustained minor damage from previous engagements. Air attacks had left some machinery compromised, slowing speeds and breaking formation. Every delay increased vulnerability. Confusion spread quietly along the decks. Signal flags were useless in the night, and wireless messages could betray positions. Officers tried to coordinate, but the chain of command strained under darkness and uncertainty. Meanwhile, British destroyers closed in silently. Radar bearings tracked the Italian ship's every maneuver. Crew members, trained for such encounters, checked ammunition, adjusted elevation, and prepared fire control. Every nautical mile they closed shortened the interval between detection and destruction. And then, near 22:15 hours, the first Italian ship misjudged distance and speed. Its turn exposed a broadside. It was a minor error, but enough for the British to finalize gun solutions. Cunningham's fleet held, waiting for the optimal moment. Darkness concealed them completely, but not forever. The trap, invisible yet inescapable, was tightening. The tension aboard both sides was palpable. Italian sailors felt the night pressing around them, uncertain but confident. British crews, conversely, were calm, controlled, and aware. Each second now carried the weight of destiny. Within moments, the night would erupt into one of the Mediterranean's most lethal naval encounters. At 22:20 hours, the silence shattered. British searchlights snapped across the water, cutting through darkness like blades. Italian cruisers, previously confident in their invisibility, were suddenly illuminated in harsh white light. Every gun turret, every deck, every man became a target in an instant. The first salvo of British 15-inch shells struck Fiume and Zara. They tore through superstructures, detonating ammunition magazines, and ripping the hulls apart. The ships had no time to maneuver. Optical rangefinders were useless. Radar-guided fire had closed the distance to less than 4,000 yards. Seconds stretched into eternity as chaos enveloped the decks. Pola, trailing and already damaged, attempted a slow retreat. Destroyers flanked her silently, launching torpedoes that cut through calm waters. Explosions rocked the vessel, and fires spread rapidly. Crew members attempted damage control, but the combination of darkness, shock, and overwhelming firepower rendered all efforts futile. Signals calling for help went unanswered. Italian escorts were too scattered to respond effectively. Cunningham's battleships remained steady. Guns methodically trained, firing with precision rather than haste. It was a calculated, almost surgical destruction. The Italian fleet, once a proud symbol of Mussolini's Mediterranean vision, was being erased in minutes. Men leapt overboard to escape flames and splintered decks. Survival was a matter of chance, not skill. Within half an hour, 3 Italian heavy cruisers lay burning or sunk. Smaller vessels scattered, some escaping, others disabled. The British had achieved what doctrine, technology, and careful planning promised: overwhelming dominance at night, exploiting the enemy's assumptions and blind spots. As silence slowly returned, broken only by distant crackling fires and survivors' cries, the Mediterranean seemed indifferent once more. The carnage was complete. What remained were floating wrecks, a handful of survivors, and the realization that naval warfare had entered a new era, where sight no longer determined the outcome, but instruments, preparation, and anticipation did. The immediate battle was over, but the consequences, both human and strategic, were only beginning to unfold. By dawn on the 29th of March, 1941, the waters off Cape Matapan bore a grim testimony to the night's violence. The Italian fleet had been decisively shattered. 3 heavy cruisers, Zara, Fiume, and Pola, were lost, each sunk with nearly all hands aboard. The exact toll varied by report, but estimates suggest over 2,300 Italian sailors perished that night. Survivors were few, clinging to rafts or debris, rescued hours later by British destroyers or coastal vessels. The British fleet had sustained minimal casualties. A handful of minor damages occurred to destroyers and cruisers, but no capital ships were lost. For the Royal Navy, the encounter validated the effectiveness of night fighting tactics, radar technology, and calculated aggression. The contrast in losses was stark, a measure not just of firepower but of planning, training, and anticipation. Reports from Italian officers painted a picture of disbelief. Many survivors could scarcely comprehend how the enemy had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. Some accounts described the blinding lights and the impossible accuracy of the British guns, phrases that underscored both awe and horror. The rapid destruction left little opportunity for defensive action, and the psychological shock on those who lived through it would linger for years. British logs, in contrast, noted the operation with clinical detachment, coordinates, times of shell impact, and torpedo results were meticulously recorded. Cunningham himself reflected on the efficiency of the attack, praising the skill of his officers and crews, yet aware that luck and timing had played essential roles. In war, even careful planning could be undone by a single misjudgment. Here, everything had aligned. Rescue operations continued through the morning. Wreckage was surveyed, bodies recovered, and survivors debriefed. The scale of destruction forced the Italian Navy to reconsider the vulnerability of its surface fleet, particularly in night operations. Strategic ports such as Taranto and Brindisi saw heightened urgency for training, reconnaissance, and air coverage, but the losses had already inflicted both material and psychological damage. The immediate aftermath was a tableau of devastation and calculation, one that would ripple beyond the waves of the Mediterranean. The battle had ended, but its human cost was only part of the story. Strategic consequences were just as severe, reshaping both sides' perception of naval power. The destruction at Cape Matapan reverberated far beyond the immediate loss of ships and lives. For the Regia Marina, the battle was not just a tactical defeat. It was a psychological blow that undermined confidence in night operations and exposed critical vulnerabilities in doctrine and technology. Italian naval officers, previously proud of their fleet's capabilities, now faced the reality that radar-equipped opponents could exploit darkness with deadly precision. Night was no longer a refuge. It was a liability. Strategically, the Mediterranean shifted in Britain's favor. Cunningham's victory secured crucial sea lanes, ensuring that convoys to Greece and Egypt could continue with reduced interference. Italian hesitation increased in subsequent months, and German commanders became more aware of the limitations within their allies' naval capabilities. The psychological impact extended to both sides. British morale soared, validating years of investment in radar, night training, and coordinated fleet operations. Italian morale, conversely, sank, burdened by the awareness that even superior numbers could be rendered ineffective by unseen technology and planning. The battle also influenced naval doctrine beyond the Mediterranean. Observers noted that traditional reliance on optical sight and daylight engagements was increasingly obsolete. Radar, signal intelligence, and coordinated maneuvers had demonstrated their decisive potential. Future operations would need to account not only for the physical strength of the enemy, but also for their ability to see, communicate, and strike in ways that defied conventional expectation. Cape Matapan's lessons were immediate. Italy delayed aggressive sorties, limited exposure of its capital ships, and increased reliance on aircraft for reconnaissance. Britain, emboldened by its success, continued to innovate in radar and night engagement tactics. Commanders on both sides understood that the night had transformed into a battlefield in itself, where a mastery of technology and timing could outweigh sheer firepower. As the Mediterranean settled into an uneasy calm, the significance of Cape Matapan became increasingly clear. It was a turning point not simply in a single battle, but in the broader understanding of modern naval warfare. The clash had ended, but its strategic shockwaves would influence decisions, doctrines, and the fate of fleets for the remainder of the war. Cape Matapan remains a stark reminder of how unseen factors can decide the fate of men and machines. In the darkness of that March night, doctrine collided with technology, and tradition collided with innovation. Sailors trained for daylight were rendered vulnerable. Ships built for speed and firepower became floating tombs. The human cost was immense, yet the battle also illuminated the evolving nature of warfare, where information, anticipation, and instruments could overshadow brute strength. The encounter marked more than a single victory. It symbolized the end of an era in naval strategy where visibility dictated engagement. Night was no longer neutral. It was a weapon in itself, wielded most effectively by those prepared to trust in tools, intelligence, and meticulous planning. The Royal Navy's triumph demonstrated that discipline and foresight could convert technological advantage into decisive action. For history, Cape Matapan offers lessons that extend beyond the Mediterranean. It teaches that assumptions about safety, tradition, or superiority can be fatal when the environment changes and the enemy adapts. collapse. It underscores the human dimension, the fear, confusion, and courage of those caught in moments they could neither anticipate nor fully control. And yet, there is a quiet, almost philosophical resonance in the aftermath. The Mediterranean returned to its indifferent calm, waves rolling over the wreckage, as if to reclaim what war had briefly borrowed. The battle passed. Lives were lost, and lessons were written in steel and fire. In that silence, history observes, mastery of knowledge, preparation, and timing often determines the course of human conflict more than numbers, pride, or might. Cape Matapan remains, therefore, a testament not only to Britain's deadly night ambush, but to the enduring truth of warfare, that the unseen, the calculated, and the unexpected shape history as profoundly as any visible force.